What if the crime scene the public has been studying for the past 3 months was never the real story? What if the blood on the porch, the open rear door, the masked figure on the camera, even the pacemaker timestamp were not evidence of what truly happened, but pieces of a scene carefully arranged to create a specific narrative? Not reality, but perception. Not what happened, but what someone wanted investigators and the public to believe happened. I spent hours reviewing a detailed expert panel discussion featuring veteran investigators and forensic specialists, a former homicide detective, a retired CSI investigator, a behavioral analyst, and a forensic psychologist, professionals with decades of experience working violent crimes, staged scenes, and complex disappearances. And when they examined the Nancy Guthrie case piece by piece, their conclusion completely changed the way this investigation looks. According to these experts, there is a real possibility that Nancy Guthrie may never have been inside her home the night she supposedly disappeared. And if that possibility is true, then nearly every assumption surrounding this case changes instantly. For months, the public has followed the same official timeline. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, spends the evening of January 31st having dinner with her daughter Annie and son-in-law Tommaso. Later that night, she is supposedly driven back to her home in Tucson's Catalina foothills. Sometime after midnight, investigators say her pacemaker records an elevated heart rate consistent with stress or fear. Around the same time, a masked individual appears on the doorbell camera outside the house. The next morning, blood is discovered on the front porch, a rear door is found propped open, Nancy's purse and phone remain inside the residence, and her walker is missing. Since that night, Nancy Guthrie has never been seen again. That is the version of events the public has accepted from the beginning. But when the panel of investigators started breaking down the evidence step by step, they focused on one detail that completely reframed the case: the last independently verified proof of life. And according to them, that proof of life is not the pacemaker data. It is not the surveillance footage. It is not the blood at the house. It is the Uber ride to Annie's home earlier that evening. That is the last moment in the entire timeline supported by an independent witness, digital records, and outside verification. The Uber driver confirmed transporting Nancy to the dinner. The ride was documented. The timestamps existed. Everything about that trip could be verified objectively. But after the Uber left Annie's driveway, the certainty ends. From that point forward, every major event in the timeline relies on what people said happened, not what investigators independently proved happened. There is no publicly released surveillance showing Nancy arriving back at her own home. No third-party witness confirming she walked through the front door. No rideshare data documenting the return trip. No camera footage showing her inside the residence later that night. The entire second half of the official narrative begins with one assumption: that Nancy actually made it home. And according to the experts analyzing the case, that assumption may be the most important unanswered question of all. John Lamb, a former homicide detective and veteran crime scene investigator with more than 30 years in law enforcement, reportedly addressed this directly during the discussion. He pointed out that investigators and the public may have accepted the crime scene too quickly without first confirming whether Nancy was physically present at the location when the supposed abduction occurred. Because if she never returned home that night, then the blood, the staged entry points, the masked figure, and the pacemaker activity could represent something entirely different. Not an abduction unfolding in real time, but a carefully constructed scene designed afterward to support a false timeline. And suddenly, every piece of evidence begins looking different. The masked figure approaching the camera no longer looks like a kidnapper arriving for the crime. It could look like someone arriving to create evidence after the fact. The blood on the porch stops being proof of a struggle and starts becoming part of a staged narrative. The open rear door no longer appears to be an escape route, but a deliberate visual clue meant to imply forced movement through the property. Even the pacemaker data becomes less certain under that theory. Investigators originally suggested the elevated heart rate indicated fear or distress inside the home during the attack. But the panel reportedly questioned whether the spike alone actually proves Nancy was physically inside the house at all. A pacemaker can record stress responses for multiple reasons, and unless investigators can independently place Nancy inside the residence during that exact window, The timestamp itself may not confirm the official story as strongly as people assume. And that is the idea these experts kept returning to throughout the discussion. The possibility that the public has been examining a staged crime scene from the very beginning without realizing it. Because once investigators stop assuming Nancy returned home safely that night, the case no longer centers on a violent intrusion into her house. It becomes something far more controlled. Something planned before anyone ever looked at the blood on the porch. John Lamb said something during the expert panel that completely shifted the direction of the conversation. According to the former homicide detective and veteran CSI investigator, the last independently verified proof that Nancy Guthrie was alive was not the pacemaker signal, not the blood evidence, and not the surveillance footage. It was the Uber driver dropping her off at Annie's house earlier that evening. Everything after that point, he explained, exists because someone told investigators it happened. Bob Gilliam, a detective with more than 3 decades of investigative experience, immediately agreed. And once the case is framed that way, the entire timeline begins to feel different. Because narratives can be built. Narratives can be shaped. And experienced investigators know that when a crime scene appears fully assembled from the beginning, blood already present, doors already positioned, surveillance footage already captured, timelines already established, one question always follows. Who created the scene, and what were they trying to make investigators believe? That is where the staging theory enters the case. Dr. Gary Brucato, a forensic psychologist and criminal behavior researcher who works alongside renowned profiler Dr. Ann Burgess at Boston College, approached the issue cautiously but directly. He made clear that he was not claiming Nancy Guthrie was definitely absent from the house that night. What he said was far more careful and far more unsettling. According to Brucato, investigators cannot definitively confirm that Nancy was physically inside the home during the alleged abduction window. And because that fact cannot be proven independently, the possibility that the crime scene was staged cannot be eliminated. In investigative terms, staging means something very specific. It means a scene is deliberately arranged to mislead law enforcement. The purpose is not simply to hide evidence, but to redirect the entire investigation toward a false version of events while the real crime occurred somewhere else entirely. A staged scene tells a story investigators are supposed to follow, even if the story itself is not real. And according to the experts reviewing the Nancy Guthrie case, the scene contains an unusual number of carefully arranged details. John Lamb pointed out that genuine abduction cases rarely unfold with this level of choreography. The open rear door propped with an object from inside the house. Blood visible on the front porch, but no continuous trail leading away from the property. Nancy's walker missing while her phone, purse, and identification remained untouched inside the home. To Lamb, the amount of constructed detail felt excessive, almost as if the scene had been prepared to communicate a specific narrative instead of reflecting the chaotic reality of a real kidnapping. He stated that in his own experience working abduction investigations, he had rarely seen a crime scene this elaborate unless someone was attempting to direct investigators toward a predetermined conclusion. Then the discussion turned to the blood evidence. The blood on Nancy Guthrie's front doorstep became one of the most publicly discussed elements of the entire investigation, but the experts on the panel examined it from a very different perspective. Bob Gilliam emphasized that he was not presenting himself as a blood spatter specialist, but based on decades investigating homicide scenes, he explained that it was entirely possible the blood had been staged, including the appearance of aspirated blood patterns. He even referenced how relatively simple tools could theoretically create that type of effect without requiring sophisticated forensic knowledge. And if the blood was staged, the implications become enormous. Because, as Dr. Brucato explained, if the blood was intentionally placed there instead of deposited naturally during an assault, then the real crime scene may exist somewhere else entirely. Investigators stage scenes when the actual location of the crime points directly toward a specific person, a specific property, or a specific connection that cannot be risked. Moving the scene creates distance between the crime and whoever committed it. Chris McDonough, who hosted the discussion, focused on another detail investigators continue struggling to explain: the blood trail itself. According to him, the blood appeared to stop at the front doorstep. There was reportedly no visible continuation across the driveway, no transfer pattern extending toward the street, No evidence consistent with someone physically carrying an elderly woman away from the property after a violent struggle. The blood was there. Then suddenly, it was not. And according to experienced investigators, that is not what authentic abduction scenes typically look like. Then another detail complicated the official narrative even further: the front door locks. Nancy Guthrie's front entrance reportedly contained 4 separate locking mechanisms. John Lamb raised the question directly during the panel discussion. If a masked intruder entered the home, subdued Nancy, and carried her out through the front door alone in the middle of the night, how exactly were all 4 locks found secured afterward? Who locked them? How were they managed during the removal of an elderly woman with mobility limitations? The panel could not arrive at a simple explanation because none of the possibilities fit neatly with the theory of a lone stranger acting alone. Either someone remained inside the home to secure the locks afterward, the front door was never actually used as the exit point, or another individual already inside the residence controlled the scene from within. Every scenario pointed investigators away from the image of a random masked intruder and toward something more coordinated. Bob Gilliam summarized the problem bluntly. According to him, the mechanics of the scene simply do not function cleanly as a one-person outside operation. Too many separate actions needed to happen simultaneously. A rear door had to be prepared from inside the property. The front area contained blood evidence. A vehicle likely needed to be positioned nearby. Multiple locks had to be managed. Timing had to remain controlled. And in Gilliam's experience, crimes requiring that level of coordination almost always involve someone already familiar with the environment. Someone operating from inside the perimeter, not an unknown stranger suddenly appearing from outside in the middle of the night. Because the more investigators analyzed the logistics of what supposedly happened inside Nancy Guthrie's home, the harder it becomes to believe the scene was as simple as it first appeared. One of the most disturbing theories raised during the expert panel centered around the masked figure on the porch, the man the internet has spent months calling Porch Guy. But according to forensic psychologist Dr. Gary Brucato, there may be another explanation for his behavior entirely. A far more dangerous one. Dr. Brucato suggested the possibility that the man approaching Nancy Guthrie's front door may not have been carefully avoiding the camera at all. Instead, he may have believed the camera was already disabled. In other words, someone may have told him the surveillance system was off, that the porch was clear, that he could approach without being recorded. But the camera was still running. And if that theory is true, it changes the meaning of the footage completely. Because suddenly, the masked man no longer looks like the mastermind of the operation. He looks like someone following instructions. Someone operating on information given to him by another person. Information that was either wrong or intentionally manipulated. He walks directly into frame, fully exposed to a camera that captures his movements while the entire country watches the footage over and over again on national television. Meanwhile, the person who knew the camera was still active remains invisible. Dr. Brucato connected this directly to the larger staging theory surrounding the case. If someone wanted investigators, reporters, and the public focused on a single visible suspect, there may be no better distraction than a masked figure caught on camera. You create an image impossible to ignore. You give the media a face, or at least a silhouette, to chase. And while every conversation centers around Porch Guy, the real story unfolds somewhere else entirely, hidden behind the distraction. Then Chris McDonough said something that shifted the conversation even further. He suggested that Porch Guy himself might not even be the primary suspect. He may be another manipulated piece of the operation. Possibly even a victim of whoever orchestrated the larger plan. The panel then turned its attention to the morning Nancy Guthrie was reported missing, specifically the public statements surrounding the family's response. And according to the retired detectives reviewing the timeline, several details immediately stood out. Savannah Guthrie publicly described calling local hospitals after Annie reportedly told her she had already contacted them. Bob Gilliam stopped on that detail almost immediately. His question was simple. If Annie had already checked the hospitals, why repeat the exact same process moments later? On its own, the detail may sound insignificant. Families in crisis repeat themselves all the time. Panic creates confusion. But Gilliam explained that experienced investigators pay close attention to moments where a narrative contains actions that do not logically flow together. In his view, when people describe events during a supposedly chaotic emergency, certain inconsistencies can become important. John Lamb expanded on that point. According to him, genuine crisis situations rarely unfold in the organized, structured way the family's timeline was publicly described. Real shock tends to produce fragmented memories, overlapping events, emotional confusion, and disorder. But the account surrounding the morning Nancy disappeared appeared unusually clean, almost too sequential. Lamb made clear he was not accusing anyone of fabrication. Trauma affects memory in complicated ways, and people often unconsciously organize painful experiences into coherent stories afterward. Still, from an investigative standpoint, he believed the structure of the narrative was worth examining carefully. Then the discussion shifted in an unexpected direction. The panel reviewed an older NBC interview featuring Annie and Savannah Guthrie from years earlier during promotion for a family book project. While watching the footage, John Lamb began observing Annie's eye movements throughout the interview. He carefully emphasized that behavioral analysis is not definitive proof of deception, especially in edited television clips, but he noted repeated rightward eye movements that, in some contexts, can be associated with constructed responses rather than naturally recalled memories. He did not overstate the observation. He simply noted it as something that caught his attention. Dr. Brucato, however, focused on something entirely different while watching the same footage. For him, the emotional center of the segment was Nancy Guthrie herself. Seeing her as a younger woman, hearing stories about the sacrifices she made raising her children, and then comparing that image to the current investigation deeply affected him. He described Nancy as someone who appeared to spend her life putting others ahead of herself, only to eventually become trapped in circumstances she may never have understood. According to Brucato, regardless of how the investigation ultimately ends, Nancy Guthrie became an instrument in someone else's larger plan. A person used for another purpose. And hearing that assessment from a forensic psychologist who specializes in violent behavior carries a different weight than commentary from television personalities or internet speculation. Then the panel raised another issue almost entirely absent from mainstream media coverage. Nancy's son, Cameron. While Annie and Savannah have both appeared publicly in various ways throughout the investigation, Cameron has remained almost completely invisible. No major public statements. No visible participation in media appearances. Almost no discussion of him in national coverage. Chris McDonough asked the question directly, "Where is Cameron?" Not as an accusation, but as a legitimate investigative observation. In high-profile missing person cases involving family members, complete silence from an immediate relative often draws attention from investigators. The panel acknowledged there could be many explanations: grief, privacy, legal advice, but they also agreed that experienced detectives rarely ignore total absence in cases receiving this level of national attention. John Lamb admitted that in his own investigative career, silence from family members was almost never meaningless. Sometimes it reflected emotional collapse, sometimes strategy, sometimes something more significant. And then came the issue investigators may consider one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case: Annie's vehicle. The FBI reportedly impounded her car for 40 days. Not 40 hours. Not a weekend forensic sweep. 40 full days. According to the panel, that length of time suggests investigators were doing far more than a routine evidence search. Modern vehicles contain enormous amounts of digital telemetry, movement logs, Bluetooth connections, GPS history, phone pairings, acceleration records, door activity, navigation data, and internal timing systems that can reconstruct a vehicle's movements with extraordinary precision. A standard forensic examination does not require over a month unless investigators are attempting to extract and analyze every available data point inside the system. Because if the official timeline surrounding Nancy Guthrie's final movements is inaccurate, the telematics inside that vehicle may eventually reveal where the real story actually began. The expert panel then turned to one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation: the telematics from Annie's vehicle. And according to the investigators reviewing the case, the length of time the FBI held that car may say more than the public realizes. Modern vehicles do not simply transport people anymore. They record them. GPS movement, speed changes, door activity, ignition cycles, Bluetooth connections, navigation routes, timestamps for nearly every action performed inside the system. Today's cars preserve digital histories with remarkable precision. Investigators know exactly how valuable that data can become in a criminal case because a vehicle often tells a more honest story than the people driving it. That is why the panel focused so heavily on one question. If Annie's account was straightforward, driving Nancy home, dropping her off, and returning back herself, why did the FBI reportedly keep the vehicle for 40 days? According to the experts, telematics data is not difficult to retrieve. In a normal investigation, analysts can extract route history and movement logs relatively quickly. 40 days suggests something far more complicated happened behind the scenes. Either the vehicle data did not align cleanly with the publicly accepted timeline, required extensive reconstruction and analysis, or revealed additional movements and inconsistencies investigators needed time to examine. None of those possibilities point toward a simple confirmation of the original story. Chris McDonough summarized it bluntly during the discussion. You do not keep a vehicle for over a month if the data perfectly supports the narrative already being presented publicly. Then the conversation moved to one of the strangest details raised anywhere in the investigation: the moon shadow analysis. An independent astronomer reportedly reviewed the porch camera footage and analyzed the shadow cast by the masked figure captured outside Nancy Guthrie's home. By comparing the angle and length of the shadow against the moon's position over Tucson during the early morning hours of February 1, 2026, the calculations allegedly pointed toward a different time than investigators originally stated. Not 1:47 a.m. Closer to 2 a.m. At first glance, a 13-minute discrepancy may not sound important, but the panel explained why that gap matters so much. The official timeline of the case heavily relies on the pacemaker event timestamp at 1:47 a.m., the moment investigators associated with distress inside the home. If independent physical analysis suggests the porch footage occurred later than that timestamp, then one of the foundational pillars supporting the timeline becomes unstable. The experts were careful not to overstate the conclusion. They acknowledged the shadow analysis still requires professional verification, but they also noted that discrepancies between digital timestamps and physical environmental evidence are exactly the kind of details that federal investigators examine intensely because they can reveal manipulated timelines, altered assumptions, or staged events. And if someone understood when the pacemaker would transmit data and intentionally structured the scene around that expected window, then investigators may eventually need to reconsider whether the timeline itself was artificially constructed. The panel then shifted toward another detail quietly sitting inside court filings connected to the investigation: a mysterious phone call originating from the Los Angeles area. According to legal documents discussed during the podcast, an unidentified individual in California made contact with someone inside the immediate family circle, but the name of the recipient was heavily redacted in the affidavit. That omission immediately caught the attention of the former detectives reviewing the case. Bob Gilliam explained why. In his experience, names are not redacted from investigative documents unless the information is operationally important. If the call involved Annie directly, investigators would naturally examine it closely. But if the call involved Tommaso, whose home, vehicle, and communications have reportedly been central to the federal investigation from the beginning, then the significance increases dramatically. Because according to the panel, investigators do not hide irrelevant details from affidavits. They hide information connected to active investigative strategy. John Lamb focused specifically on the redaction itself. In his view, the FBI's decision to conceal the identity of the person receiving the call strongly suggests the communication remains relevant to the direction of the case. Somewhere within the immediate family orbit, someone received a call from Los Angeles, and investigators do not yet want that connection publicly exposed. Then the discussion turned toward something far more subtle: language. The panel revisited one of Savannah Guthrie's early public statements about her mother's disappearance. During the statement, Savannah reportedly used the word humans in a way that behavioral analysts found unusual given the emotional context of the situation. Dr. Brucato explained that during high-stress public communication, word choice can sometimes reveal psychological distancing. In emotionally personal situations, people often naturally use intimate language, words like mother, family, people, or loved ones. More clinical or generalized terminology can occasionally suggest emotional detachment or subconscious distancing from the subject being discussed. Brucato immediately clarified that language alone proves nothing. Behavioral analysis is never based on a single phrase or isolated observation. But in complex investigations, analysts examine clusters of details rather than individual moments. And according to the panel, when the language patterns are considered alongside the staging indicators, the telematics questions, the timeline inconsistencies, and the unresolved forensic evidence, each element begins reinforcing the same growing concern. After nearly 4 hours of analysis, the experts did not arrive at one definitive theory. In fact, they specifically avoided forcing a single conclusion. These were not internet commentators building a dramatic narrative. They were experienced investigators and behavioral specialists carefully examining unresolved evidence. But despite their different perspectives, they agreed on several critical points. The staging theory cannot be dismissed. The final independently verified proof of life remains the Uber ride to Annie's home. Everything after that depends largely on testimony and interpretation rather than confirmed independent verification. The blood evidence may be consistent with a constructed scene. The mechanics of the doors and locks suggest either multiple participants or inside familiarity with the property. The masked figure on the porch may not have fully understood the role he was playing. And the 40-day forensic examination of Annie's vehicle almost certainly happened for a reason investigators considered significant. By the end of the discussion, one conclusion seemed to unite everyone on the panel. Somewhere inside this case, hidden between the staged elements, the conflicting timelines, the missing confirmations, the sealed evidence, and the unexplained details, there is at least one person who knows exactly what happened to Nancy Guthrie. Not because they studied the case afterward, because they were part of the plan before it ever began. So where does this investigation go from here? According to the experts who analyzed the case, the answer may already be sitting inside federal evidence files the public has never seen. Right now, the DNA recovered in the Nancy Guthrie investigation is reportedly being processed at Quantico using advanced probabilistic genotyping and genetic genealogy technology, tools designed to isolate identities from complex mixtures and partial biological samples. These are the same methods that have solved cases investigators once believed were impossible to crack. And somewhere inside those laboratory results may be the name of a person who never expected their DNA to matter. At the same time, investigators are still following the Bitcoin trail connected to the ransom communication sent on February 10th, the message that simply read, "We are ready to talk." Unlike traditional cash transactions, blockchain activity leaves permanent records. Every wallet interaction, every transfer, every digital movement creates a trail investigators can continue tracing long after the public believes the lead has disappeared. Blockchain evidence does not simply vanish. It waits. And then there is the telematics data from Annie's vehicle. 40 days of analysis. 40 days of route histories, movement logs, timestamps, location data, and digital records preserved inside an FBI evidence file. According to the investigators on the panel, authorities would not dedicate that amount of forensic attention to a vehicle unless they believed it contained something critically important to reconstructing the true timeline of events. Then there is the redacted name in the affidavit. The unidentified person connected to a call originating from the Los Angeles area. The public does not know whose name sits behind that blacked-out section of the document. But federal investigators do. And according to the panel, that matters. Because investigators are no longer looking only at isolated clues. They are examining the structure behind the scene itself, the people who may have shaped the narrative from the beginning. Near the end of the discussion, Dr. Gary Brucato reflected on Nancy Guthrie herself, and his comments shifted the focus away from theories and evidence for a moment and back toward the woman at the center of the case. He described her as someone who, by every public account, appeared deeply kind and resilient. A woman who raised her children largely on her own. A woman who continued living quietly despite age, health struggles, and loss. Someone who spent evenings writing in her journal and sitting peacefully on her porch, never imagining she would become the center of a national investigation. And then Dr. Brucato said something the panel could not shake. He suggested that Nancy may never have been the true target at all. She may have been used. Not the enemy, not the architect of the conflict, but the instrument inside someone else's larger plan. A person caught in the middle of motives that may have involved leverage, money, fear, control, humiliation, or something investigators still have not fully uncovered. And if that theory is correct, then the people responsible for constructing this narrative also made a critical mistake. Because staging a crime scene is extraordinarily difficult to sustain over time. It requires coordination. It requires silence. It requires multiple individuals maintaining the same version of events under growing pressure from forensic analysis, federal scrutiny, digital evidence, and public attention. And secrets become harder to protect every time another person knows them. According to the panel, investigators may already understand far more about this case than the public realizes. The FBI knows what the telematics data revealed. They know whose identity sits behind the affidavit redaction. They know what the DNA evidence is producing inside Quantico right now. Most importantly, they may no longer be focused on the scene itself. They may be focused on the people who built it. Because if the crime scene was staged, then the real investigation is no longer about the blood on the porch or the masked figure on the camera. It is about